The loudest certainty is often the first thing to disappear when real experience quietly walks into the room. The bright autumn sun hung high above the outdoor shooting range as laughter drifted across the firing line where competitors had gathered for a weekend precision pistol challenge. A polished steel plate stood 40 yards away, reflecting flashes of sunlight each time the breeze nudged it gently against its chains. It looked close enough to tempt confidence, yet far enough to punish it. One after another, 5 younger shooters stepped forward holding compact Snub-Nose revolvers, each convinced that steady hands and quick reflexes would be enough. The first shooter fired all 5 rounds without hearing the sound he wanted. The second adjusted his stance and tried again with no better result. The third blamed the heavy trigger. The fourth blamed the short barrel. The fifth simply laughed after missing again and lowered the revolver with an embarrassed grin. Around them, the small crowd exchanged jokes that sounded almost rehearsed. "Nobody clears that plate with a 2-inch revolver," one man called out. Another shook his head and added, "Those little things are made for close range, not 40 yards. Even the range officer smiled politely without disagreeing. Near the back of the gathering, an elderly man wearing a faded olive field jacket stood beside an aging pickup truck with his hands resting loosely inside his pockets. Walter Hayes was 82 years old, his silver hair neatly trimmed beneath a weathered baseball cap, his lined face calm beneath the warm afternoon light. He had arrived quietly several minutes earlier and had watched every attempt without offering a single opinion. He never reacted to the misses. He never smiled at the jokes. His attention remained fixed on the steel plate swaying gently in the distance rather than on the people surrounding it. Standing near the firing line, Gunnery Sergeant Ethan Brooks crossed his arms while watching another competitor unload an empty revolver. At 34 years old, Brooks carried himself with the confident posture expected from an experienced Marine. He respected discipline, trusted modern training, and believed some equipment simply had unavoidable limits. Looking toward the older man standing alone near the truck, he noticed Walter had been watching the challenge without moving. "Sir?" Brooks called with a friendly smile that carried more amusement than invitation. "You thinking about giving it a try?" Several competitors turned toward Walter. One of them chuckled before saying, "If you hit that plate once with a borrowed Snub-Nose, I will buy dinner for everyone here." More laughter followed. Walter walked forward at the same relaxed pace he had used when entering the range, stopping beside the bench where the revolvers rested after each relay. He looked at the compact .38 special revolver lying on the shooting mat and spoke with quiet courtesy. "May I borrow this one?" The owner looked surprised before handing it over. "Be my guest," he replied. "Just do not blame the gun." Walter accepted the revolver with both hands, carefully opened the cylinder, confirmed it was unloaded, then gently closed it again. He neither praised nor criticized the firearm. Instead, he simply allowed it to settle naturally in his weathered hands as though introducing himself to an old acquaintance. Brooks watched with growing curiosity. Most people immediately tested the trigger or raised the sights toward the target. Walter did neither. He looked first at the grip, then at the front sight, then quietly lifted his eyes beyond the firing line toward the distant steel plate shimmering beneath the clear blue sky. Around him, the laughter slowly faded into an unexpected silence as more people began wondering why the old veteran appeared far more interested in understanding the revolver than proving anything to the crowd. Walter Hayes continued holding the borrowed revolver with the same quiet patience that had already begun changing the mood around the range. He never hurried to the firing line. Instead, he slowly turned the compact .38 special in his hands, studying it from every angle beneath the warm afternoon sunlight. The revolver showed years of honest use. The blued finish had worn thin around the edges of the cylinder. Tiny scratches covered the frame. The walnut grips had become smooth from countless hands, and a faint ring of powder residue remained near the front of the cylinder despite its recent cleaning. Walter noticed every detail without saying a word. The owner of the revolver smiled awkwardly. "It is old, but it still works." Walter nodded gently. "Most good tools do." Ethan Brooks watched from only a few feet away with growing curiosity. He expected the elderly veteran to complain about the short barrel, or the heavy double-action trigger like everyone else had throughout the afternoon. Instead, Walter carefully opened the cylinder once more and examined each chamber with calm attention before closing it using deliberate, practiced movements that never looked theatrical. Brooks finally asked, "Do you shoot revolvers very often?" Walter looked up with a faint smile. "Not as often as I used to." One of the younger competitors laughed. "You picked the hardest handgun on the table." Another added, "There is a reason nobody wants that one for this challenge." Walter rested the revolver naturally in one hand before quietly asking, "Who cleaned it last?" The owner raised his hand. "I did this morning." Walter smiled politely. "You did a careful job." The younger man seemed surprised. "You can tell?" Walter lightly ran his thumb along the edge of the cylinder. "Someone took pride in it." The brief exchange left the surrounding crowd unexpectedly silent. Nobody had expected the old veteran to compliment the revolver instead of making excuses for it. Walter slowly raised the handgun toward the distant steel plate without placing his finger on the trigger. He was not aiming. He simply allowed the front sight to settle naturally against the bright afternoon landscape before lowering the revolver again. Brooks noticed something unusual. Walter never squinted at the target. His eyes wandered beyond it toward the tree line, then toward the tall grass bending gently beneath the breeze. He watched the movement of a loose paper target hanging on another lane. He even glanced upward as a small flock of birds crossed the clear blue sky before disappearing beyond the trees. Brooks frowned slightly. "What are you looking at?" Walter answered quietly. "Everything the bullet has to travel through before it reaches the plate." The younger Marine looked toward the target again, trying to understand what the veteran meant. To him, the lane appeared perfectly ordinary. There was open air, a steel plate, and 40 yards between them. Walter seemed to be noticing details invisible to everyone else. He shifted his stance only slightly, testing the uneven ground beneath his boots before relaxing once more. Nothing about his movements suggested nervousness. They reflected familiarity earned over many decades. The revolver remained pointed safely downward while resting comfortably in his weathered hands. No one joked anymore. The laughter that had filled the range only minutes earlier had quietly disappeared, replaced by a growing curiosity that spread from one spectator to the next. Even those waiting for their own turn on neighboring lanes found themselves watching the elderly veteran instead of preparing their own equipment. Brooks folded his arms again, but this time it was no longer an expression of confidence. It was the posture of someone beginning to question whether the limitations everyone blamed on the revolver had ever belonged to the revolver at all. Walter Hayes remained exactly where he was, the borrowed revolver resting comfortably in his weathered hands while the quiet attention of the entire range settled around him. He never asked how many people had already failed the challenge because the empty cartridge boxes scattered across the shooting bench answered that question well enough. Instead of stepping immediately toward the firing line, he slowly lifted the revolver once again, allowing the front sight to drift naturally into his field of view before lowering it just as calmly. Ethan Brooks watched every movement with growing concentration. "You are still not aiming," he finally observed. Walter smiled faintly. "Not yet." Brooks looked puzzled. "The target is right there." Walter glanced toward the steel plate shimmering beneath the bright afternoon sun. "The target has not changed all day," he replied. "Everything else has." The younger Marine instinctively followed. Walter's eyes across the range. The breeze shifted slightly, moving through the tall grass in uneven waves. Dry leaves rolled slowly across the packed gravel near the firing line. A loose corner of a paper target fluttered softly on a neighboring lane before becoming still again. Somewhere behind the tree line, a crow called once before silence returned. Walter seemed to absorb each tiny detail without effort. He shifted his boots only an inch, testing the firmness of the ground beneath him, then relaxed his shoulders until every trace of tension disappeared. Brooks had spent years teaching shooters to focus almost entirely on the front sight, yet the elderly veteran appeared to be studying the entire world surrounding the shot instead. "What difference does any of that make?" Brooks asked quietly. Walter answered without looking away from the range. "The bullet travels through the same world you do. Ignoring that world never makes it disappear." Those words lingered in the still afternoon air. No one interrupted. Even the younger competitors who had laughed only minutes earlier now listened without speaking. Walter rested his thumb lightly against the worn walnut grip, his fingers naturally settling into place around the revolver, as though they remembered something older than conscious thought. The polished wood felt smooth beneath his skin, except for one tiny shallow mark near the bottom edge where years of careful use had left a faint indentation. His thumb paused there for only a moment. The sensation awakened a memory buried beneath decades of ordinary life. The bright autumn range slowly faded behind the quiet weight of another place and another season. He remembered the sharp scent of gun oil mixing with damp morning air, the rough texture of sand beneath heavy boots, and the low voice of an instructor standing beside a long row of young soldiers holding service revolvers under a gray sky. The instructor had walked slowly past each student before stopping beside Walter. Without raising his voice, he had placed one hand gently against the young soldier's wrist and said, "Stop trying to control the gun. Learn to control yourself first." Walter had frowned, with the impatience of youth. "But the sights keep moving." The instructor smiled. "Good. That means you are alive. Your job is not to eliminate movement. Your job is to understand it." The lesson had seemed impossible then. Every student wanted perfect stillness. The instructor wanted awareness instead. Walter remembered spending endless mornings learning that the smallest details mattered. A shifting breath. A tightening finger. A wandering thought. Every missed shot began before the trigger ever moved. The memory remained as vivid as yesterday before gradually giving way to the warm sunlight of the present. Walter looked down briefly at the borrowed revolver still resting calmly in his hands. The shallow mark on the walnut grip no longer belonged only to this firearm. It had quietly become another reminder that the most valuable lessons were never stored inside the weapon itself, but inside the person patient enough to carry them for a lifetime. The memory settled over Walter Hayes with remarkable clarity, as though the passing decades had never managed to soften the voice of the man who first taught him what true marksmanship meant. The old outdoor range disappeared completely, replaced by a military training facility many years earlier where rows of young soldiers stood beneath an overcast morning sky with service revolvers resting quietly in their hands. Every student believed the secret to accuracy lived somewhere inside the weapon. Their instructor knew better. He walked slowly down the firing line with calm confidence, stopping beside each recruit without raising his voice or correcting them with embarrassment. When he reached Walter, he gently took hold of the revolver for only a moment before placing it back into the young soldier's hand. "This piece of steel has no opinions," he said. "It never becomes nervous. It never becomes impatient. Every mistake belongs to the person holding it." The words stayed with Walter long after the lesson ended. Day after day the instructor refused to let the recruits fire immediately. Instead, they spent hours practicing nothing more than their breathing, their stance, and the smooth movement of pressing the trigger, without disturbing the sights. Many complained that they wanted to shoot instead of standing still. The instructor only smiled. "The shot begins long before the sound." Walter remembered how frustrating those early mornings had been. Young strength always wanted quick results, but experience demanded quiet repetition. On one particularly windy afternoon, another recruit blamed his missed shots on the weather. The instructor shook his head gently before pointing toward the moving trees beyond the range. "The wind is not your enemy," he explained. "It has been honest with you since before you arrived. The problem is that you only noticed it after you missed." The lesson transformed the way Walter understood every firearm he would ever hold. He stopped searching for perfect conditions because they rarely existed. Instead, he learned to recognize what the world was already telling him. The weight of the revolver. The rhythm of his breathing. The firmness of the ground beneath his boots. The changing light. Even the smallest distraction inside his own thoughts. Every detail became part of the same conversation. Months later, after completing one of the most demanding qualification courses, the instructor quietly handed Walter an old cleaning cloth worn soft by years of careful use. "Keep this," he said. Walter looked confused. "It is just a cloth." The older man smiled patiently. No. It is a reminder. Respect every firearm you touch, even if it belongs to someone else. Skill never begins with confidence. It begins with respect. That simple lesson remained with Walter through every assignment, every training range, every deployment, and every peaceful year that followed. He had carried many different firearms throughout his life, but the habit never changed. Every borrowed weapon deserved the same patience as one he owned himself. The memory slowly dissolved beneath the warmth of the present afternoon as the sounds of the outdoor competition returned. The breeze once again crossed the open range. Dry leaves rolled gently across the gravel. Conversations remained hushed as everyone watched the elderly veteran standing quietly with the borrowed .38 special revolver resting naturally in his hands. Walter lowered his eyes toward the revolver for one brief moment before carefully brushing an invisible speck of dust from the frame with his thumb, the same thoughtful gesture he had practiced for decades. Ethan Brooks observed the movement without speaking. He suddenly realized the older man had not spent the last several minutes preparing to impress anyone. He had simply been showing the borrowed revolver the same quiet respect that had shaped an entire lifetime of disciplined marksmanship. Walter Hayes slowly lifted his eyes from the borrowed revolver as the last traces of memory settled back into the quiet rhythm of the afternoon. The steel plate continued swaying gently in the distance, catching flashes of sunlight each time the breeze brushed across the range. No one seemed eager to speak anymore. The laughter that had welcomed the elderly veteran only a few minutes earlier had disappeared completely, replaced by the unmistakable silence of curiosity. Ethan Brooks remained standing near the firing line, watching Walter with an expression that no longer carried skepticism alone. There was something else now, something closer to respect waiting for proof. Before either man spoke again, an older voice drifted across the gathering. I thought I recognized that posture. Several people turned toward the parking area where an elderly man wearing a faded brown field jacket was walking slowly toward the firing line with the relaxed confidence of someone completely at home around a shooting range. His name was Richard Collins, a retired Army firearms instructor who occasionally volunteered as a range safety advisor during local competitions. As soon as he came within a few yards of Walter, he smiled warmly. Walter Hayes, he said. Walter looked up and returned the smile immediately. Richard. It has been a long time. The two men shook hands firmly without unnecessary words. Brooks looked from one man to the other. You know each other? Richard laughed quietly. Know each other? We spent years teaching military pistol courses together. A few of the younger competitors exchanged surprised glances. Richard looked toward the borrowed revolver resting in Walter's hands before nodding with obvious understanding. Still treating every firearm like it deserves respect. Walter answered simply. Some habits are worth keeping. Brooks stepped a little closer. You both instructed military marksmanship? Richard nodded. Walter taught some of the most difficult revolver qualification courses I ever saw. Many instructors who later trained others first learned patience from him. The crowd became noticeably quieter. One competitor who had joked earlier lowered his eyes without saying anything. Brooks looked genuinely puzzled. He never mentioned any of that. Richard smiled. That sounds exactly like Walter. A young spectator standing near the bench asked curiously. Was he always this accurate? Richard chuckled softly before answering. Accuracy was never the first thing people noticed about him. Calmness was. Accuracy usually arrived afterward. Those words seemed to settle naturally over everyone listening. Brooks studied Walter again, this time noticing details he had overlooked before. The veteran never tightened his shoulders. His breathing never changed. Even the way he held the borrowed revolver reflected decades of quiet confidence rather than confidence borrowed for the afternoon. Richard glanced toward the steel plate hanging 40 yards away before looking back at Brooks. You are watching someone who spent a lifetime teaching people that marksmanship begins before a firearm is ever raised. Brooks slowly uncrossed his arms. The certainty that had shaped his opinions throughout the day quietly gave way to genuine curiosity. Why have I never heard his name? Richard answered without hesitation. Because the finest instructors are usually remembered by the people they trained instead of the people they impressed. No one argued with him. Walter simply opened the cylinder one final time as the range officer handed him 6 cartridges for the official challenge. One by one he loaded each chamber with calm, deliberate precision before gently closing the cylinder without spinning it. The soft mechanical click echoed clearly in the still afternoon air. Every conversation across the range came to an end. Richard stepped quietly aside. Brooks took one slow step backward. The competitors who had laughed earlier now stood shoulder to shoulder in complete silence, their attention fixed entirely upon the elderly veteran who calmly walked toward the firing line carrying nothing except a borrowed revolver, a lifetime of discipline, and a reputation that had finally begun to reveal itself. Walter Hayes stopped at the firing line with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent far more years learning patience than collecting applause. The borrowed .38 special rested naturally in his right hand while his left hand settled gently around the grip, not forcing the revolver into position but supporting it as though the movement had become part of his breathing decades earlier. The afternoon breeze drifted across the range once more, carrying the faint scent of dry leaves and gun oil through the crisp autumn air. 40 yards away, the steel plate rocked almost imperceptibly against its chains, flashing silver whenever the sunlight caught its surface. Walter did not stare at it. He allowed his eyes to soften, taking in the entire scene instead of chasing a single point. Ethan Brooks stood several feet behind him, watching every movement with complete attention. Richard Collins folded his arms quietly beside the range officer, saying nothing because he already recognized the familiar rhythm unfolding before him. Walter drew one slow breath through his nose and released it naturally. He never rushed to raise the revolver. The younger competitors expected dramatic preparation, but there was none. Everything about him remained remarkably ordinary. He shifted his weight slightly until both boots rested evenly on the packed gravel beneath him. His shoulders relaxed. His elbows settled into a comfortable position. Even his grip seemed lighter than anyone expected. Brooks finally whispered to Richard, "He looks like he is not trying at all." Richard answered without taking his eyes off Walter. "That is because he stopped trying years ago. Now he simply does the work." Those quiet words lingered over the silent crowd. Walter slowly raised the revolver until the front sight entered his vision. His breathing remained steady. The steel plate appeared small against the bright background, but he never fought to hold the sights perfectly still. Tiny movements remained, almost invisible, gently floating with each heartbeat. Instead of resisting them, he accepted them. The revolver became an extension of balance rather than force. His index finger rested against the trigger with almost no visible pressure. Brooks noticed something he had never taught his own students because he had never truly seen it before. Walter was not waiting for absolute stillness. He was waiting for perfect understanding of the movement itself. The breeze softened for a brief moment. A loose paper target on the neighboring lane stopped fluttering. The sunlight brightened as a passing cloud drifted away from the range. Walter quietly allowed one more breath to leave his lungs before the smooth pressure of his trigger finger continued almost invisibly. The crisp report echoed across the range, followed less than a heartbeat later by the unmistakable clear ring of steel. The sound rolled across the open field before fading into complete silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Several competitors instinctively looked toward the target to confirm what they had heard. The steel plate continued swinging gently beneath the bright afternoon sky. Brooks blinked once, then looked back toward Walter with genuine disbelief. Richard merely smiled without surprise. "One," he said softly, almost to himself. Walter lowered the revolver only slightly, never celebrating, never changing expression. He calmly reset his grip and drew another slow breath exactly as he had before. There were still 5 cartridges waiting inside the borrowed revolver, but the first sound of steel had already accomplished something greater than striking a distant target. It had quietly shattered every assumption that experience could ever be replaced by confidence alone. The echo of the first clear ring had barely faded before the entire range settled into a silence so complete that even the rustling leaves seemed unwilling to interrupt it. Walter Hayes remained exactly where he stood, the borrowed revolver still resting naturally in his hands. There was no smile of victory, no glance toward the crowd, and no attempt to acknowledge the stunned expressions gathering behind him. He simply breathed once, slowly and evenly, allowing the same calm rhythm that had carried him through the first shot to return once more. Ethan Brooks found himself holding his own breath without realizing it. Every lesson he had ever taught emphasized consistency, but what stood before him was something deeper than consistency. It was complete trust in a process refined over decades. Walter raised the revolver again with identical movements, his shoulders relaxed, his wrists steady, his eyes focused not on forcing perfection but on recognizing the exact moment when everything aligned naturally. The second report rolled across the range, followed almost instantly by another bright metallic ring from 40 yards away. Several spectators exchanged wide-eyed glances. One younger competitor quietly whispered, "That cannot happen twice." Richard Collins answered with a gentle smile, "It usually does." Walter lowered the revolver only enough to reset his breathing before beginning again. The afternoon breeze shifted slightly, carrying a faint current across the open lane. He noticed it without appearing to react. His stance remained unchanged. His breathing never hurried. When the third shot broke the silence, the steel plate answered once more with the same unmistakable note that drifted across the range like the clear tone of a distant church bell. Nobody laughed now. Nobody searched for excuses. The only sound after each impact was the quiet clink of the swinging plate returning to rest. Brooks slowly shook his head. "He is reading every condition before he presses the trigger." Richard nodded. "He is reading himself first." Walter paused briefly before the fourth shot, not because he doubted the revolver, but because patience had always mattered more than speed. The sunlight reflected brightly from the plate as another gentle breath left his lungs. The revolver spoke again, and moments later the familiar ring echoed through the crisp autumn air. A few spectators instinctively applauded before quickly stopping, almost embarrassed to disturb the remarkable stillness surrounding the elderly veteran. Walter acknowledged none of it. The revolver rose for the fifth time. His weathered hands never trembled. His expression remained peaceful beneath the brim of his faded cap. Brooks realized that every movement looked exactly like the one before it. There was no correction, no frustration, no excitement, only disciplined repetition. Another smooth trigger press, another clean report, another bright sound of steel rolling back across the range. 5 consecutive hits. The crowd stood motionless. The revolver still held one remaining cartridge. Walter looked quietly toward the distant plate as it continued swaying against its chains. He was not counting success. He was simply completing the task he had accepted. Richard folded his arms and quietly said, "He never shoots against a target. He shoots against the standard he carries inside himself." Brooks lowered his eyes for a moment before looking back toward Walter with genuine admiration replacing every trace of doubt. Around them, no one seemed interested in speaking anymore. The afternoon had begun with confidence directed toward equipment and youthful certainty. It had quietly become a lesson about discipline, humility, and the extraordinary power of experience patiently earned over an entire lifetime. Walter gently raised the borrowed revolver one final time, while every person on the range waited in complete silence, already understanding that whatever happened next would be remembered far longer than any ordinary shooting competition. Walter Hayes allowed one final slow breath to settle before the last cartridge completed the circle inside the borrowed revolver. Nothing about his posture changed. His shoulders remained relaxed, his hands steady, and his attention rested not on the people watching behind him, but on the small steel plate standing quietly 40 yards away beneath the clear autumn sky. The afternoon breeze drifted across the range once more, lifting a few dry leaves before letting them settle harmlessly onto the gravel. Walter waited without impatience. He had spent too many years learning that the right moment could never be forced. It could only be recognized. Ethan Brooks stood completely still, his eyes fixed on the elderly veteran. The confidence that had once filled his expression had transformed into careful observation. Richard Collins smiled faintly, already knowing exactly what disciplined patience looked like when it reached its highest form. Walter gradually increased pressure against the trigger without disturbing the sights. The final report echoed across the open field, and an instant later the steel plate answered with its sixth bright, unmistakable ring. The clear metallic sound rolled across the range before fading into absolute silence. Nobody moved. For several long seconds, the only motion came from the steel plate gently swinging against its chains while sunlight flashed across its polished surface. 6 consecutive hits. 40 yards. A borrowed Snub-Nose revolver that moments earlier everyone had dismissed as incapable of the task. Walter calmly lowered the revolver, opened the cylinder, and confirmed it was empty before turning it with the same quiet respect he had shown from the beginning. He carefully placed the spent cartridges into his palm and handed both the revolver and the empty cases back to their owner. "Thank you for trusting me with it," he said softly. The younger man accepted the revolver with both hands, almost as though it had somehow become more valuable than when he had loaned it only minutes before. "I do not think I will ever look at this revolver the same way again," he admitted. Walter smiled gently. "There was never anything wrong with the revolver." Those simple words settled over the gathering with surprising weight. Brooks slowly walked forward until he stood only a few feet away from the veteran. His voice carried none of the playful confidence from earlier in the afternoon. "Sir, I owe you an apology. I thought the challenge was impossible." Walter looked at him kindly. "You believed what most people believe." Brooks nodded. "I judged the equipment before I understood the person holding it." Walter gave a quiet smile that reached his eyes. "That is an easy mistake to make. Just do not keep making it." Around them, several younger competitors approached the firing line, not to examine the revolver but to ask Walter about breathing, patience, and trigger control. Nobody asked for a secret trick because they already understood there was none. Richard Collins quietly stepped beside Brooks and said, "Did you notice something?" Brooks looked toward Walter as the veteran patiently answered questions from shooters half his age. "What?" Richard folded his arms comfortably. "Nobody is talking about the 6 hits anymore. They are talking about how he achieved them." Brooks watched in silence for another moment before slowly nodding. He finally understood that the afternoon had never truly been about a difficult shot or a borrowed firearm. It had become something far more valuable. Every person standing on that range had arrived believing that experience grew old while equipment became better. They were leaving with the quiet realization that true mastery did not fade with time. If anything, time had patiently refined it until even the simplest action carried the unmistakable weight of a lifetime spent learning lessons that no shortcut could ever replace. The afternoon sun had already begun its slow descent when the conversations around the range gradually returned, but they carried a very different tone from the ones that had filled the air only an hour earlier. Nobody was laughing about impossible shots anymore. Instead, small groups stood quietly discussing breathing, patience, discipline, and the remarkable calm of an elderly veteran who had never once tried to prove that he was better than anyone else. Walter Hayes slipped his hands into the pockets of his faded field jacket and prepared to leave exactly as quietly as he had arrived. He had no interest in trophies, photographs, or applause. For him, the lesson had already reached the people who needed it. Ethan Brooks walked beside him before Walter reached the parking area. The younger Marine hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Sir, would you answer one last question?" Walter stopped and turned with the same patient expression he had carried throughout the afternoon. "Of course." Brooks looked back toward the distant steel plate still hanging peacefully against the blue sky. "How do you become capable of doing something like that?" Walter followed his gaze toward the target before answering in a calm voice. "You stopped trying to defeat the target." Brooks frowned slightly. "Then what do you work on?" Walter smiled gently. "Your habits. Your patience. Your respect. The target only reveals whether those things are real." The younger Marine remained silent for several seconds, carefully considering every word. Richard Collins eventually joined them with an easy smile. "He told us almost the same thing 40 years ago," he said. Walter laughed softly. "I suppose I never found a better answer." Brooks extended his hand. This time the gesture carried no challenge and no uncertainty, only sincere respect. Walter accepted the handshake warmly. "Thank you," Brooks said. "Today I learned more by watching than I have during many days of instruction." Walter nodded. "Then today was worth everyone's time." Before returning to his truck, Walter reached into the pocket of his jacket and removed a small folded cleaning cloth that had grown soft with age after decades of careful use. He looked at it for a quiet moment before handing it to Brooks. The younger Marine accepted it with visible surprise. "I cannot take this." Walter smiled. "Years ago someone gave it to me for the same reason I am giving it to you." Brooks unfolded the cloth carefully. It looked ordinary except for the worn edges that spoke of countless hours spent caring for well-used firearms. "What should I remember?" he asked quietly. Walter answered without hesitation. "Respect every tool you touch. Respect every person you meet. You never know which one has spent a lifetime teaching lessons that cannot be measured by appearances." Brooks folded the cloth again with obvious care before placing it inside his own pocket. Neither man felt the need to say anything more. Walter climbed into his old pickup truck, started the engine, and slowly drove toward the exit as the late afternoon sunlight reflected softly across the windshield before the vehicle disappeared beyond the trees. Brooks remained standing near the parking lot long after the truck was gone, his eyes resting on the empty road instead of the shooting range behind him. The steel plate would eventually stop swinging. The sound of 6 clean hits would gradually fade from memory. What would remain was something far quieter and far more valuable. Every person who had stood on that range had arrived believing that mastery belonged to strength, youth, or better equipment. They left understanding that the greatest skill often travels unnoticed, carried by people who no longer feel any need to announce who they are. Some lessons echo long after the sound is gone, because true respect is never demanded. It is quietly earned, faithfully carried, and remembered for a lifetime.